Why do we care about income inequality or shifts in wealth? This first chart from pre-crisis, on the y-axis is household debt to GDP and Gini on the right. Some of you are probably familiar with this. I mean, it's a very crude analysis of what I call keeping up with the Jones. You know, economists like to say that some income inequality is a good thing. It incentivizes people to work harder. But the reality is that in advanced economies, this push down in wage shares, if you will, or income inequality has meant that individuals seek out debt to try to close this gap. Particularly in the US, this had implications for household purchases. Now, this is not to say that income inequality is the driver of the household bubble in the United States. I mean, there are a number of factors, including, of course, banks' easy supply of credit to households. There was the famous ninja loans, which was no income, no job, but still you could get a mortgage. There's also lower or easy monetary policy. There's also a Bush domestic policy to push household ownership among low-income earners. I mean, there's a variety of factors. But the thing I want to illustrate with this chart is that it's important to note that individuals try to close the income gap with debt, which can have severe consequences, economic consequences, as we've seen. Another important consideration along the same lines is sort of global imbalances. And this has sort of been one of the key issues that have been discussed within the context of the current crisis. So on the one hand, in a number of advanced economies, you had excess demand for credit to close the gap, if you will, in terms of income inequality. But on the second hand, you had excess savings in a number of surplus countries. I mentioned emerging economies here, but also Germany being, of course, the elephant in the EU room, about export-led growth. But the thing I want to highlight here is that this excess savings in some of the larger emerging economies is due also to precautionary savings, partly due to having experienced previous crises before, but also due to lower wage growth, in particular in relation to productivity, but also in the absence of social protection. And this has led to sort of an export-oriented model, which has meant that these excess savings, if you will, have not been channeled into social protection, into promoting domestic demand, but rather to facilitate, if you will, the credit to bubble in other instances. Again, not the only cause, but still an important consideration. One argument about capital shares is okay, but rising capital shares, rising profit shares are great because it goes to investment and then it creates employment. But the reality is that investment in advanced economies has been meager or weak at best and hasn't grown in line with growing profit shares. There's a similar story in emerging economies, but to a lesser extent. So the point here is that investment, of course, has continued to grow significantly in a number of these economies, but haven't really grown as fast as the profit shares. One thing I would also note in the emerging economies, which stands in stark contrast to the advanced story, is that the dividend payouts within firms in the emerging economies has more or less stayed the same. So there's been a slight increase in the tendency to pay out dividends, but nowhere near the relationship we see in advanced economies. Coming back to some of the issues, the ILO, we've also done work on the global Gallup survey, and we basically, unlike OECD, we said, okay, we're going to do an index anyway. As dangerous as that may be, I think partly because of the issues Juan raised is that within the Gallup survey you have a plethora of questions which look at different issues. And it's very difficult to really try to assess which is doing what. But still, we thought, okay, we're going to take a series of questions and combine them to an index and see how they relate to some of the factors. I think what's interesting from the ILO perspective is that growth seems to matter much less than employment and incomes in determining what we call social unrest or social cohesion, which I think has important consequences for what we've seen in terms of the Arab Spring and the crisis. Where do we go from here? I think the first point is less regressive tax systems. I mean, Juan mentioned, I think very importantly, the role of tax and benefit systems in reducing inequality. But two things I'd like to note is that the tax system has been used counterproductively to now. So in the first instance, in advanced economies, the income tax rates of the top marginal tax rates have actually fallen. The second point is that during the crisis, with the fall in revenues and fiscal consolidation, basically a large set of countries have decided to move to VAT, which, as we know, is very regressive. So we have the tax system, very important, but all indicators point to the fact that, if anything, what we're going towards is a more regressive tax system. So, I mean, I think the main message here at the bottom is that we need a more balanced kind of tax or policy approach to rewarding work incentives. I mean, no one would disagree that we need to reward work incentives, even for the top income earners, but there needs to be some kind of balance with that and revenue generation. I think second, of course, is again social protection. And this, of course, can help not only facilitate transition, it also helps, as Juan also mentioned, it brings people together. It makes them part of the decision-making process. It gives them a safety net. But the reality is that social transfers, again, have declined in most of the economies, with the few exceptions in Latin America. And second, we have about 20% of the world's population which doesn't have any social protection whatsoever. And finally, on unemployment benefit schemes, they're literally or non-existent in many of the major emerging economies. In Brazil, I mean, there's a very small scheme which covers roughly maybe 5% of employment. But these schemes actually cost something. But I think we would argue that these types of programs are not that expensive, certainly in relation to some of the costs that have been associated with trying to address this crisis. So the question is, how do you divert, or how do you target resources rather than where do the resources come from? I think it's just a question of making priorities and making tough decisions. Rewarding productivity. I mean, I think we would argue that wages need to grow in line with productivity, but this is not something just for workers, it's also something for management, it's something for CEOs. And there needs to be a more clear decision-making process of how we do that. It's not something that's easily done, it's not something that's done on a weekly basis, it's not something that's done on a monthly basis, but it's something that we should be working towards. And here, from an ILO perspective, the role of social dialogue, I think, is very important. Finally, encouraging real investment. Here we did a simulation basically within the advanced economy. We said, okay, look, all of this money that went to dividends, if we'd kept the dividend to profit ratio the same leading up to the crisis, we would have gotten another 1.6 million jobs in advanced economies alone. Which means paying out considerable amounts in dividends, but just keeping the share of profits the same. Another one, simulation we did is, okay, in advanced economies, if we'd kept investment growing at the same pace as GDP, we would have received another 6 million jobs. So the question is, can we, by promoting productive investment, by encouraging investment in what we call the real economy, not financial assets, we can have better labor market and social outcomes. I mean, there's a number of ways to do that. We can target SMEs, there's tax credits for innovative firms, but there needs to be more of a recognition of how the financial system plays a strong role in influencing some of the behavior within the non-financial firm. And here, on the previous slide, I mean, I mentioned the role of corporate governance, but this is a very tough issue. Should there be independent board members? I mean, it's a very, very tricky issue of how board of directors can better control CEO pay, because there's clearly an insider conflict of interest to some extent. So just to conclude, profits and dividends grew at the expense of income inequality. Income inequality was one of the key elements, if you will, of the crisis, but there are a number of others. What worries me the most, I think, is that a number of policies that are being implemented in order to address the crisis may, in fact, exacerbate income inequality going forward. And I think hopefully during the course of the 2 days we can show that income inequality is not only economically inefficient, but it's also socially untenable. Thank you.